The year is 1863. Let's picture ourselves in old San Francisco. We're standing in Portsmouth Square. We hear the steady sound of hammering, probably coming from the cobbler's shop down on the corner. And we watch horse-drawn carriages and buggies and carts going up and down the street. Across from us, there's a tobacco shop, and we're standing in front of a window filled with calico bonnets and tastefully designed hats. As we stand here, we see carriages pull up with some of the leading citizens of San Francisco. I think that was Mrs. Ralston, the wife of the president of the Bank of California, who just got out of that carriage. Oh, look, she's going into the hat shop. Ooh, look at that beautiful carriage with the fringe on top. Why, it's stopping here too. An elderly gentleman and an elegantly attired young woman get out of the buggy, step up onto the boardwalk, and go inside the millinery shop. Just as the door closes behind them, it opens again, and a young man holding the arm of an older woman steps out. We hear him say, "Come along, mother. We don't want to be late." It does seem surprising that men seem to accompany their mothers, sisters, sweethearts, and wives when they shop for a hat. Here comes someone walking down the street. Let's see if she'll talk to us. "Excuse me, ma'am. We were wondering about this millinery shop. Can you tell us anything about it? It certainly looks like it does a good business." "Oh, it just shows you how one person can make a difference. It's really all because of the woman who opened this shop about, I think it was a little over a year ago." "Oh, could you tell us something about her?" "Well, she is a lovely young woman, and so friendly. She came here from back east. I don't remember exactly where. Her husband died, poor thing, and she decided to come out west and start a new life for herself. Had a terrible journey getting here. Why, just like the Donner Party, her wagon train ran into snowstorms and blizzards. Then because of all the delays, they ran out of food. Why, she was lucky to get here alive. And her shop is a wonder. Why, she always has the latest style hats. Look, there she is now. That's her, reaching in the window for that velvet hat. Isn't she beautiful? Really a charming young woman. Oh, here's my carriage. Good day." In the window, we see a young woman picking up a hat. Oh, she is beautiful. Just then the shop door opens again, and a tall, thin man wearing a gold watch chain walks past us, and then stops to bite off the end of a cigar. "Sir, excuse me. I saw you leave the millinery shop. I wonder if you could tell us anything about the young woman who manages it." Taking a big puff on his cigar, the man smiles. "You're not from around here, are you? Let me tell you, a more delightful woman I have yet to meet. She's a widow from somewhere back east, and not only is she sweet and gracious, she is exceptionally interesting to talk to. Now, even if you're not from around here, you must know there's a lot going on. Why, just last week, a fellow from Kentucky made another gold strike. Yes, they're still finding gold up there in the Sierra foothills. And have you heard about the silver being mined in the Comstock lode? And I hope you've seen the beautiful mansions here in San Francisco. Why, when I came here a few years ago, I was surprised to find a bustling social life, balls, dances, even opera performances. Why, if it weren't for the Union soldiers stationed at the Presidio Army Fort, why, some days I could almost forget about the terrible Civil War. Have you heard the rumors that Lee plans to send ships around Panama and attack us here in California? Oh, yes, we have lots to talk about, and it is amazing how that young woman in there, why, she keeps herself up to date on all the news. Now, if we were to stay on this corner, we would see wagons leaving the hat shop all hours of the day and night, wagons laden with hat boxes. Obviously, this young woman has a very successful millinery shop. So, we've seen with our own eyes and heard with our own ears what San Franciscans know about the young woman who manages the millinery shop. When she arrived in San Francisco after her journey from St. Louis to San Francisco with the covered wagon train, she received a warm welcome from the citizens of San Francisco. There were many lonely men happy to offer this deserving young lady their friendship and guidance. There were gentlemen with mining interests, bankers, and young officers at the Presidio, happy to offer this friendly girl with her aristocratic style companionship and advice. They proudly escorted her to balls and dances. You could depend on her wearing a stylish gown. And she always carried with her a delicate Irish lace shawl. Usually she had her escort drape the lace shawl over her shoulders, but sometimes she wore it lightly over her hair as a scarf, and now and then she would loop it around her neck with one end draping itself in front of the other. The shawl had been a gift from her grandmother on her 16th birthday, and she said it reminded her of the gentility, fragility, and graciousness of life. All right, I've told you what San Franciscans believe to be true about this young woman, but most of their information was not in the least bit true. They had no idea that she had joined that wagon train traveling from St. Louis to San Francisco with a false identity, traveling as the daughter of one of the families. She was not a sweet young widow, nor was she from somewhere back east. Her quaint little millinery shop was a facade. The truth was that she had been carefully trained to be a spy for the Confederate Secret Service. Her name was Lucia Ann Hill, and she was from one of the most distinguished families in Cartersville, Georgia. Her grandfather had been the third largest landowner and the fifth largest slave owner in Georgia. Her father, however, was an abolitionist, and when he took over the plantation in 1853, he had appalled and shocked family and neighbors by granting freedom to many of his 3,800 slaves. His liberal views were probably a result of his having been sent to Scotland for his education. Anyhow, when he returned, he was a Whig in politics and an abolitionist. Lucia Ann, however, was very close with her grandfather, and like her brothers, aunts, and uncles, she did not support her father's views. Several of her uncles and cousins had served terms in the Georgia legislature, and when Georgia seceded, Lucia Ann's 5 older brothers joined the Confederate Army. Her younger brother tried to join too, but he was sent home when they discovered he was too young, 10 years old. Lucia Ann, 18 when the war began, was attending a girls' boarding school in Richmond, Virginia. Beautiful and popular, she'd been invited to social events up in Washington, and the year before the war began, had even attended a function at West Point. When war was declared, Lucia Ann told her brothers she wanted to do something to help the cause, and they suggested contacting the Secret Service. Women were needed for various contributions to the struggle. They were being carefully selected and sometimes sent out on dangerous missions. Lucia Ann contacted the Confederate Secret Service and was accepted. They assigned her to the Treasury Department, and arrangements were made to send her to St. Louis to be trained as a gold agent. She traveled by stagecoach to St. Louis, which was easy to do. Despite the war, women could still travel freely on the stagecoaches, and at this time, late 1861, The South controlled the Mississippi Valley and part of Missouri. Now, the first task in St. Louis was eliminating her Southern accent, which would, of course, have been a dead giveaway. They had to decide between having her speak in a Yankee dialect or with a British lilt. They decided on the British accent, which turned out to be not as difficult as it could have been, because Lucia Ann's best friend at the Richmond boarding school had been the daughter of the British Trade Commissioner, and they used to have fun mimicking each other, switching dialects. But her other classes were a lot more demanding. Lucia Ann was carefully instructed in matters pertaining to finances, mining, freight routes, and how to contact Confederate sympathizers. They made her memorize the names and addresses of the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle were the members of an underground network of Southern patriots, or spies, depending on which side of the war you were on. When she completed her training in 1862, she was sent to San Francisco. They wanted Lucia Ann to help them get gold from the Sierra Nevada and silver from the Comstock lode. One of her assignments was to find out when and where gold shipments were being sent. Then she would relay this information to Southern guerrillas so they could waylay the shipment. A second assignment was to act as a repository for gold and silver contributed by San Francisco Southern sympathizers. They came up with the idea of having her manage a stylish millinery shop which could be used as a repository for this gold and silver. A third assignment was to arrange to ship this gold and silver to various underground points of entry into Confederate territory. Her fourth assignment was to keep the Confederacy up to date on the movements of Yankee officers. And Lucia Ann turned out to be a masterful undercover agent. But even though she was talented, brave, and clever, she couldn't have done all this by herself. She had help, and not just from Southern sympathizers and the Knights of the Golden Circle, but also from many unsuspecting people. Remember all those men eager to offer her advice, happily adjusting her Irish lace shawl over her shoulders? Do you remember who they were? Officers at the Presidio, men with mining interests, bankers, valuable sources of information. Remember the man who said she was so interesting to talk to? That hat shop turned out to be the perfect cover for clandestine meetings, as well as a place for Lucia Ann in seemingly trivial chatter to pick up important information. And you remember those wagons filled with hat boxes which left her shop all hours of the day and night? Most of those wagons had false bottoms, and they were filled with gold and silver. These wagons with the hat boxes would leave San Francisco in a wagon train, but as soon as they could, when they weren't in view of Union troops, they would quietly veer off and make their way to the South. Now, this underground activity wasn't going unnoticed by federal secret agents. They'd already arrested many of the leaders of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and what happened to them, Lucia Ann did not like to think about. Some were thrown into military prison, and others, well, they just disappeared. California was a long way from Washington. Communication was slow, so people in authority in the West did pretty much as they pleased. Lucia Ann knew that even though she was an attractive young woman, Army officers would not show her any mercy. Every day she lived in constant fear of being discovered, recognized as a Southerner, as a spy. She had to be on her toes, aware all the time so she wouldn't make a slip and give herself away. By late 1864, she was getting unbearably nervous. Every day she thought, I need to get out of here before it's too late. One morning, she finally made up her mind to let her superiors know that it was too dangerous for her to stay in San Francisco any longer. That day, when she went down from her upstairs apartment to open the shop, She found one of her contacts, disguised as a worker with a mop and bucket, cleaning the floor of the shop. He told her that the Union Secret Service, aware that there was a leak in their security system, had devised a plan to deliberately release false information. Now, when they saw how this information was acted on, then they'd be able to figure out how information was getting slipped through to the Southern spy ring. Now, if Lucia Ann could detect and intercept this false information, she would preserve the entire spy network. "All right, I'll just do this one last assignment," she told him, "and then I'll tell people I've been called back east to help my mother." Now, fortunately, she was already planning to attend a dance at the Presidio the next night, where she would be able to meet with some of her valuable contacts. Her escort was a young officer that she had gone out with before, and actually grown to like very much. Sometimes she would lie in bed and fantasize what it would be like to be married to Captain Arnold. But he was a Yankee, and she would never marry a Yankee. The next night, Lucia Ann entered the ballroom on Captain Arnold's arm. People immediately surrounded her with the usual flurry of greetings and compliments. She managed to slip away and talk to a few people alone, selecting two for more confidential conversations later. Then Captain Arnold lightly touched her shoulder. "My dear," he whispered in her ear, "there's someone here I want you to meet." Lucia Ann turned around, looked up, and felt cold terror sweep over her. She could feel the blood leave her face. Her knees felt weak. There, waiting to be introduced, stood a young man she recognized. She had met him at West Point. He was from the South, but he'd obviously chosen to join the Union Army. Lucia Ann stiffly acknowledged the introduction under her assumed name. She forced herself to look him straight in the eye and say, "I am happy to make your acquaintance, sir." With all the chivalry of an officer and a gentleman, he took her hand and bowed. Perhaps he hadn't recognized her. Could that be? Then the music started, and Lucia Ann motioned to Captain Arnold that she was ready to go out on the dance floor. As they waltzed, she peered over Captain Arnold's shoulder and watched the young man. He seemed to be looking at her. Then he turned and walked over to talk with two other Union officers. Lucia Ann leaned against Captain Arnold. "I've a headache. Would you mind if we went outside for a few moments?" As soon as the door closed behind them, Lucia Ann flung her arms around Captain Arnold. "I can't imagine what's the matter with me. Would it be too much of an inconvenience if I asked you to take me home now?" They found a driver and returned to the millinery shop, where to Captain Arnold's disappointment, Lucia Ann jumped out of the carriage. "I'll see you tomorrow, John. You're a dear. Thank you." She blew him a kiss and ran up the stairs to her apartment over the millinery shop. In her room, she tore off her ball gown, changing to riding clothes. Then she stuffed a few things in a small bag. She grabbed her money, diary, and the Irish lace shawl. Then she turned down her oil lamp, leaving it burning so it would look like she was there. In just a few minutes, Lucia Ann was saddling her horse and then riding out into the night, headed for a house set up for just such an emergency. The next morning, Southern sympathizers hid her in the back of a cart and took her to Monterey, where she boarded a British ship headed for South America. Lucia Ann left the ship when it stopped at Panama. She hired a rider to take her by horseback overland across Panama to the Atlantic Ocean. There she bought passage on a ship sailing to Jamaica. At the dock in Jamaica, Lucia Ann had some good luck. On the pier, she ran into her uncle, a blockade runner who was in Jamaica picking up arms and supplies. And so she traveled with him back to Savannah, and from there made her own way to the plantation in Cartersville. By the time she got home, Lucia Ann was exhausted, but she didn't get to rest. There was no peace on the plantation. First of all, she was horrified to see what the Yankees had done to Georgia. Then, grief-stricken, she learned of the deaths of her brothers. One had been killed in Maryland, 2 at Gettysburg. Another brother, wounded with Lee's army in Virginia, had been sent home, and just before she arrived, he had died from his wounds. Then a letter arrived with the news that her oldest brother had been taken prisoner. He was in a prisoner of war camp in New York. A few weeks later, another letter came, informing her that he had died of tuberculosis in the prison camp. And if all this wasn't bad enough, her father, who had aged greatly during her absence, when this second letter arrived, he couldn't shake his depression, and he refused to leave his bed. Before long, he joined his warrior sons. Lucia was almost too busy to grieve, trying to keep the plantation going and nursing her younger brother, barely a teenager now, who had diphtheria. Then he died, and Lucia Ann was alone. Grief-stricken, angry, bitter, she vowed to keep that plantation running. And by herself, she did. It wasn't easy. There were problems with guerrilla outlaws, returning disillusioned soldiers, and tax collectors. But Lucia Ann and the plantation survived. Then one night, when the war had finally come to an end, Lucia Ann was sitting on the veranda. There was a full moon, and her lace shawl shimmered softly in the moonlight. She couldn't stop thinking about the war, San Francisco, Captain Arnold, her brothers, her father, the Yankees. She stood up and looked at the moon. Then she turned and slowly walked behind the house where refuse was burning. She stood there staring at the flickering flames, and then suddenly, with a tug, she yanked the lace shawl from her shoulders and flung it into the flames, and stood there, watching it burn. A year later, Lucia Ann married and moved to Arkansas. Unfortunately, it wasn't a good marriage. Family members said she and her husband were always fighting, and they raised 2 of the meanest boys that ever grew up in Arkansas. She died a bitter, hating, and hated old woman. Do you know what I think happened? I think that when Lucia Ann threw her shawl into the flames, her Irish lace shawl that had protected her on her dangerous mission, the shawl that represented to her gentility and the graciousness of the Southern way of life, with that gesture, she put out of her life forever all thoughts of love or forgiveness. Now, you may be wondering, how do we know this? One of Lucia Ann's descendants sent an article to a magazine that was soliciting family history. California folklorist Hector Lee saw the article and wrote to the family. He asked if they had more information and for permission to see Lucia Ann's diary. They told him that when the courthouse in Richmond burned down, all records of the Confederate Secret Service were lost. And they said they didn't want to release her diary, since many prominent families who helped the Southern cause during the Civil War are still living in San Francisco, and they didn't want to make those families uncomfortable. Even though she wasn't fighting for the side of the Civil War I would have supported, I think Lucia Ann was a heroine. She was a courageous woman, putting her life on the line for what she believed in. And that's the story, Lucia Ann Hill and her Irish lace shawl.